Group policy has been a major part of Windows Server management going all the way back to the days of Windows 2000 Server and continues to be used today. Now, to be a successful administrator who manages a Microsoft network, it is crucial to have a solid understanding of how to control a user's environment. Now, how do you do that, you might ask? Well, one way is by using group policy. You're going to learn all about group policy processing. We're also going to check out a couple of troubleshooting tools, which will come in very handy when group policy just isn't working quite the way you expected. Now, let me introduce myself real quick here. My name is Ed Liberman, and I've been teaching people about Windows Server since the 1990s. So please join me in my LinkedIn Learning course on implementing group policy in Windows Server 2022. When it comes to group policy management, one of the most basic items you need to be familiar with is something called a group policy object, or for short, sometimes it's just referred to as a GPO. So what is a group policy object? Well, just like it sounds like in the name, it is an object in Active Directory, and this particular object contains group policy settings. Now, there's all kinds of stuff we can do with these group policy objects and these settings that are contained within, and we'll go through a lot of that as we go through the different videos in this course. But right now, I want to show you how you would go ahead and create one of these group policy objects. So to do this, I will tell you I am on a domain controller, and I'm looking at the server manager. So in the upper right, I'm going to go up to the Tools menu, and you'll notice there's an option here for Group Policy Management. Okay, we're going to be doing almost everything in this course in this tool right here, Group Policy Management. When looking at this tool, you can see here that we have our landandhotel.local forest, and if I expand that, you'll see here that it breaks it down into the different domains in this forest, the different sites in the forest, and then actually a couple of extra little tools that we'll talk about later on in the course called Group Policy Modeling and Group Policy Results. Now, if I expand the domains, you see here I have one domain that exists in my particular forest, and the name of that forest is landandhotel.local. If I expand that domain, I will see all the different containers, okay, or the organizational unit containers that I can work with when it comes to group policy, and I will explain a little bit more about that later, as well as being able to see group policy objects and certain filters and starter GPOs and stuff like that. So we're going to go through pretty much all of this as we go through the course. But for right now, let's just keep it simple. How do we create a group policy object? Well, the obvious thing might be to click on a container here that says Group Policy Objects. So I'm going to click on it, and you'll see here that there are two group policy objects that are actually created by default when you create the forest in the domain, okay? So this happens by default, and it's always, and I'm going to do the bottom one first, the default domain policy, which you will always have to pretty much by default use this to affect everything within the domain. And then the one on top is the default domain controllers policy, which is one that is used specifically to control settings on your domain controllers. Now, I don't want you to worry about that too much now, okay, because we'll address these a little bit later. But I want to show you how exactly would I go ahead and create a new group policy object. Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right-click on the group policy objects. I could also right-click in the blank area. Either way would be fine. And then I'm just going to select New. And from here, there's not a whole lot to do. When you are first just creating a group policy object, what you do is you go ahead and give it a name. So I'm just going to call this one Demo GPO, just to give it a name. And the only other thing we would do at the point of creation would be to determine if we were going to use a source starter GPO, which we are not going to do in this case. And in fact, I will talk to you about using a starter GPO in another video. So for right now, I'm going to show you, create the GPO, just give it a name, click OK. And just like that, I have created a new group policy object in the landandhotel.local domain. There's a whole lot more that needs to be done with this besides just putting it here. And I'm going to go through that as we go through the different videos in this course. So we were able to see that when creating a new GPO, we have the option of starting with a source starter GPO. Okay, so let's take a look at what that means. So first of all, over on the left, we're still looking at group policy management. You'll see we have an actual option here for starter GPOs. So I'm going to click on that now. Now you'll see here that the very first time you ever click on this, you get a little message to say, hey, you know what? This folder doesn't even currently exist. Click the button below to create this folder. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Starter GPOs Folder. And fairly quickly, it goes ahead and it creates this Starter GPOs folder. And there are a couple of starter GPOs that it has added as a default. Basically, group policy remote update firewall ports and group policy reporting firewall ports. Okay, so apparently has to do with the firewall ports. But we don't have to use those two specific starter GPOs. There's a few different options that we have. One option is if we were to right click on the starter GPOs folder here, or in the blank space, either way, and then select new, we could go ahead and we could create a new starter GPO and go ahead and just give it a name, right? So we'll just, instead of new starter GPO, let's make this demo starter GPO. And if I wanted to, I could put a comment here, which would help explain what maybe this particular starter GPO was going to be used for. Although lots of times you'll put that right into the name as well. I'll click OK. And now I've created a new starter GPO. Now let's go ahead and jump back to our group policy objects folder and say that we want to do a new GPO. I'm not going to go through this process, so I won't even bother naming it. I just want to show you that with source starter GPO in the dropdown, I now could pick any of the 3 starter GPOs, the 2 that were built in automatically and the one that I just created. Now, just like with everything else with creating a GPO, now here with the starter GPOs, I will tell you that, we're not done, right? We would have to go ahead and we would have to configure this GPO. So I'd have to go in and configure all the different settings on this particular starter group policy object. And really what it does is it kind of acts as a template. It's kind of like a starting template so that any future GPO that's created using a starter GPO will automatically have the settings that are in that template. And then you can tweak, whatever GPO you want from there. Now, before we wrap things up here, there is one other thing I want to show you, and that is down near the bottom, you'll see here we have load cabinet and save as cabinet. What these are for is for the ability to basically have a whole series of starter GPOs. If you've taken the time to build out all these starter GPOs, I can save it as a cabinet file. And the purpose for doing that would be for taking some other system, right? So maybe a different domain or even a different forest that would be within your organization. You would go ahead and you'd want to import all those starter GPOs. Well, guess what? That's what the load cabinet button is for. Now, I will also tell you that if you scan the internet, you will find different sources out there where they have created cabinet files which contain a whole bunch of starter GPOs. And the whole point behind this is that these are all templates that will help you to create new group policy objects in your organization that might make sense for certain typical scenarios. Now, I mentioned that besides just simply creating a group policy object, that there are other things that need to be done in order for this group policy object to actually serve a purpose in your organization. All right, and the next step after creating a group policy object would be to do what's called link the GPO to a container of which has objects that you want the group policy object to be having an effect on. I want you to know that basically you can link a GPO to 3 different types of containers. You can link a GPO to a domain. Okay, so here, for instance, we have the landandhotel.local domain. You can link a GPO to a site. And so if we had any sites, which we don't, we would be able to go ahead and see them here, and then we would be able to link a GPO to that site. And the third type of container that you can link a GPO to would be an organizational unit, okay, which we can see within our domain here. Right, we have some organizational units that have already been created before I started this course. Nothing super fancy, but I have the Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York containers. Those are organizational unit containers, as well as the domain controllers organizational unit container, which is there by default when Active Directory is installed. Now, if you want to be able to see where a group policy object is linked, well, take a look here. Under land and hotel.local. Okay, so right here underneath it, you see where it says default domain policy? Oh, and by the way, when you click on a group policy object, you're going to get this little message just basically saying, hey, if you make any changes, those changes are going to be global to the GPO. So I will explain what that means, but I'm going to actually clear that message. Just wanted to explain what you were seeing. So this default domain policy, right, which we saw as being one of the two that got created by default, that is linked to the domain. And how do I know that? Because it's directly under the domain. If I were to expand the domain controllers organizational unit, you will see that this is where we have our default domain controllers policy, which has been linked. And these are things that all happen by default. I did not do any of this. This happens by default. It creates a default domain policy and it creates a default domain controllers policy. It links the domain policy to the domain. It links the domain controllers policy to the domain controllers. All right, so that kind of makes a little bit of sense. But what about when we want to go ahead and link a group policy object of our own, right? So if I go back to group policy objects, and here I have demo GPO. So I have to decide where I want demo GPO to be linked. So for instance, let's say I'm going to link that to the Chicago organizational unit. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on Chicago and I'm going to select link an existing GPO. And when I do that, I can pick from any and all of the GPOs that I have in this particular domain. And in fact, you'll see here if I had multiple domains, it says look in this domain. I could select any of my other domains to pull the GPO from. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select demo GPO and I'm going to click OK. And now you can see that demo GPO has been linked to the Chicago organizational unit. How do I know this? Because it exists right underneath. That's where it's been linked. Now, one other thing you should know about linking GPOs is that a single GPO can be linked to multiple locations. So, for instance, I will go ahead and I'm going to jump down here to New York and I'm going to link an existing GPO. I'm going to select demo GPO. And you'll see here that I have demo GPO linked to New York. And demo GPO is linked to Chicago, right? Same GPO linked to two different containers. That means that the settings in this GPO will apply to all of the objects inside Chicago container and inside the New York container. But let me show you something else that can be done. Let me go ahead and let's jump back up here to Chicago and let's link another GPO. Now, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because we're not going to take one called default domain policy. But just for the sake of demonstration, I just have to work with what I have here. I'm going to select another GPO. And I want you to see that now the Chicago container has two GPOs that are linked to it. So two different GPOs of settings that are going to have some sort of an effect on the objects in the Chicago organizational unit container. I will also show you that once you have multiple group policy objects within that container, over in the right area here, you'll see that there is a link order. And it shows link order, demo GPO is 1, default domain policy is 2. And we can change that order. All you have to do is just basically click on one, then you can click the down arrow or the up arrow just to move it up and down. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail as to why that is, but when we get into the section on group policy processing and understanding how group policy objects are processed, that's where this matters. Okay, it's the order that it will process these GPOs. All right, so that's how you can link a GPO to a container so that it can begin having an effect on the objects in that container. Then when it comes to the process of creating and linking GPOs to containers, there is one last thing I want to show you, and that is that you can actually do this quite quickly and efficiently. Right? Up to this point, what I showed you was you would go to group policy objects and you would create a GPO, and then you would go to a container and you would link that GPO. And we'll just pick on Los Angeles here just to pick on something. I will show you that what you can do is you can do this all in one step. So if I right click on a container that's allowed to have a GPO link to it, we have our link existing GPO, but look what we have right above it. create a GPO in this domain and link it here. So if I click on that, we get our new GPO box where we have to go ahead and give it a name. So I'm just going to call it another GPO just to give it a name. We could pick a source starter GPO if we wanted. I'm not going to. And I'm going to click OK. And when I do, I want you to see what happens. What happens is it creates a GPO. It's already linked in this Los Angeles container. And if I go down to group policy objects, you will see that another GPO is a GPO that has been created in this domain and is fully available to be linked to other containers as well. Okay, so again, as a for instance, if I go to New York and I say link existing GPO, hey, there's another GPO. I can add it there. Okay, so again, I would say for the most part in the real world production environment, this process is probably one of the most common processes out there where you actually create and link the GPO to the container that you primarily are creating that GPO for, and you do it all in one shot. When it comes to understanding how group policy processing works, the most important thing for you to understand is the order of group policy object or GPO application and inheritance. Now, to help you understand what this order is and how it works, there are some letters I want you to remember. Okay, and the letters are on the screen here. They are L, S, D, and OU. And not only do you have to remember the letters L, S, D, and OU, but you need to remember them in order. This is the order of application and inheritance of our group policy objects. Now, I don't know if this will help you at all, but for me, the letters LSDOU have been said to me and by me so many times. To me, it's almost like I've invented a word, right? I just say it like it's a word, LSDOU. I don't know what language that word would be, but just automatically thinking LSDOU, LSDOU, LSDOU. So let's get into what these letters mean. Well, the L, first of all, stands for local. Now, this is the one area of LSDOU that I want to tell you that you can't really apply a group policy object to. You can apply or link a group policy object, as we saw, to either sites, domains, or organizational units. But there's nothing local that you can do. You can't link it to a local machine. What I can tell you, however, is that every machine in our domain is going to have its own individual local policy settings. Okay, so what we're saying here is that any local policy settings that were set on the individual machine, they're going to apply first. That's what local stands for. Now, you might be able to guess what these other letters stand for because I just said it a few moments ago. The next letter is S for site, and that's because you can link a GPO to a site within your forest, and when you do that, those settings that are contained within that GPO will apply to all of the objects in that particular site. Okay, so that happens next, right? You have your local settings and then you have your site settings. The D stands for domain, right? Because you can link a group policy object to a domain. And so to kind of take us through this process here, first, they will attempt to apply settings that are locally on a machine. Then they will see if that machine exists within a certain site within our forest. And if so, to look for any group policy objects linked to that site and apply those. Next, it will see what domain you are in, and it will look for group policy objects linked to that domain and apply those settings. And then finally, the last step here is OU, which stands for organizational unit. Okay, what it's going to do is it's going to look to see what organizational unit an object resides in. And then that's the last thing it's going to do is look for group policy objects linked to that organizational unit and apply those settings last. All right. Now, it's really, really important that you understand the order of application inheritance here. It is crucially important to understanding when using group policy. Okay. You have to know that the order is the local settings will be first, site-based settings next, domain next, and then organizational unit. And on top of that, I need to take this just a step further and tell you that the final step would be it's actually LSDOU, OU, 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 OU. And the reason why is because we can have a hierarchical organizational unit structure, right? Or OU structure. And so what we're saying is you might have a parent OU and then you might have a child OU. And if the object exists in the child OU, what it's going to do is it's going to actually take any GPOs linked to the parent organization unit and apply them. And then it's going to go to the child organization unit that the object's in and apply the group policy settings to that if there's any GPOs linked to that OU. All right. Now, beyond just this LSDOU, OU, 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 there is one more thing you need to know when it comes to the order of application and inheritance. And to show you this, I'm actually going to jump away from the image on your screen and we're going to go back to our domain controller. Okay, back here on the domain controller, I am highlighted on one of my organizational units. And I mentioned this in another video, but because there are multiple GPOs linked to this particular organizational unit, well, we then have an order of application based upon the link order that we assign, okay? And that is true not just at the organizational unit level. That can be true at the site level, the domain level. It doesn't matter. If there are multiple GPOs linked to one particular container, well, then we are going to go ahead and we're going to have to actually assign the order of application of those GPOs. Now, why is this significant? If you're listening to this and you've never worked with group policy objects, you might be thinking, why is he pounding this in so hard? Well, the reason this is so important is once we get into looking at the actual group policy settings, which we'll do later on in the course, you'll see that a lot of these settings are kind of like light switches that you either turn the setting on or you turn it off. And the problem is that you can have conflicting settings on the same object, right? You can have a user log in who is a member of the landandhotel.local domain and who has settings that are being applied with the domain policy, but then that user might, let's say, be in the New York office and has these other GPOs, and those GPOs may have the same setting that's been set, but it's opposite, right? One of them might turn a setting on, and one of them might turn a setting off. So how do we know what takes precedence? Who wins? How do you know whether the setting ends up on or off? Well, the way it happens by default is the last setting applied wins. And the way I used to demonstrate this when I used to teach in a live classroom is I would literally have everybody line up outside the classroom and then come in one at a time and flip the light switch either on or off. And then ultimately, we got to determine who got to win whether the lights are on or off. And it was always whoever the last person in the room was. Hopefully, maybe that helps if you can kind of picture that. All right, so that's why it is so important to understand the order of group policy, application, and inheritance, and why it is so important to remember LSDOU. So now that I have really kind of pounded it into you how important it is to understand LSDOU and the default order of application and inheritance and why it's so crucial to applying group policy objects, well, now I'm going to give you a couple of ways of defying the default rules. All right, so there are a couple of exceptions. Those exceptions are called block inheritance and enforced. Those are the names of the two settings that you can set that will alter the default LSDOU application and inheritance within group policy. So let me show them to you here. First of all, let's talk about block inheritance. Now, this is something that you would do down at a lower level of the LSDOU process, right? So down near the bottom would be what? OU, right? Organizational unit. That's one of the last steps in the inheritance process. So let's take an organizational unit. Like here I have Los Angeles, all right? We're going to take this organizational unit, and what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know what? I don't want to have the settings from the sites and from the domains and things like that. I want to just have the group policy object settings that I have linked directly to this organizational unit container. So what I would do is I would right click on the container and you'll see here that there's an option for block inheritance. And when I click on it, I know it may be hard to see depending on what kind of screen you're looking at, but there is now a blue circle with an exclamation point in it, okay, on the Los Angeles container. And what that icon represents is that this container is blocking inheritance from any of the GPOs up above. All right, so any settings that were done at the domain level or even as part of a site, they would get ignored, and we would only apply the GPO settings that is linked directly to the Los Angeles container. All right, so that is one way that we can alter the default group policy, object inheritance, and application. Now, the other one I mentioned is a setting called enforced. Now, enforced is something you would do higher up in the LSDOU chain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up one level, and I'm going to go up to the domain level. Now, you don't do anything on the domain itself, right? Like if I take landonhotel.local, if I right-click, you'll see there is block inheritance, but there's no enforced setting here. And that's because it's not done on the specific domain itself. But if you have, let's say, a group policy object, right? Here's our default domain policy, which is linked to the domain. And we want the settings in this object to have an effect on everything in the domain all the way down, no matter what. Then what we can do is we can right-click on that policy and we can select enforced. And when I do that, again, maybe hard to see, but there's a little icon that appears on that default domain policy now. It looks like a locked padlock. That icon represents that this policy has the enforced setting on it. Now, there's a couple things that you need to know about when you do enforced. Number one, if you do an enforced policy up at the domain level, that means any block inheritance that has been set below, right? So Los Angeles, right? We said block inheritance. Enforced actually will take precedence. Okay, enforced says you have to take these settings. You are not allowed to block them. These settings will be enforced, period. That's the first thing enforced does. The second thing enforced does is if you have a setting, let's say up here at the domain level on this default domain policy, and then you have the same setting down somewhere else in the LSDU structure, you have another setting, and let's say the setting in the default domain policy, it turns something on, and the setting in the GPO further down says turn that same setting off. Well, enforced means that the order of application inheritance no longer matters. My setting wins, right? The enforced setting wins. Okay, so if the default domain policy turns something on, it does not matter if any other policy turns it off. It will remain on because, again, those settings are enforced, period. All right, so that's the two exceptions that we can create to the default order of application and inheritance. Now, there's one quick little side note. In the event that you have been working with group policy for a long time, like going all the way back to the real early days, like Windows 2000. Maybe you've been away for a while and you're coming back. If you are ever familiar with a term called no override, that is what enforced used to be called. It's the exact same setting. It was previously called no override, and then they changed it to being called enforced. For me personally, I thought no override was a better name for it, but I get it either way. You could either say, here's the setting and there's no overriding the setting, and I get where there's enforced, where you say, hey, this setting is enforced. All right, so that's the one other thing I just want to make sure that you understand in the event that you've ever worked with group policy and are familiar with that term no override. Now, when a group policy object is linked to a container, it basically affects all objects within that container. Now, throughout the course up to this point, I keep saying all objects. The reality is it's all computer objects and user objects, okay? That is what is affected by group policy objects. And when we get into the actual settings, you will see why it's computers and users. All right, so basically, when we say that we're linking a GPO to a container, we're affecting all computers and users that are in that container. But if we don't want it to affect all the users and computers in a container, we have the ability to further narrow down who or what the group policy object has an effect on by using something called security filtering. So here, I am highlighted on a GPO. I'm on my demo GPO. And then you'll see down here in the middle section here, over to the right, it says security filtering. It says the settings in this GPO can only apply to the following groups, users, and computers. Yeah, and I should mention, when I say it's just users or computers, well, groups are included because group objects are created for the purposes of managing users. All right, so that kind of counts on the user side of things. So what do we have here? By default, it's going to apply to all authenticated users. In other words, by default, there is no security filtering. It's just applying to everybody. Now, there are two different approaches that we can take to using security filtering. One way is we can say that it's only going to apply to a specific group or specific users or specific computers within a container. The other way would be to say that it applies to everybody with the exception of a certain group, users, or computers. So let's take a look at this. First, let's talk about how we can have it apply just to one specific group. What we can do here is, you'll see that by default it says authenticated users. If I click on add, I can add another group here, for instance. So I'm going to actually put in CUST and hit check names. And these are just a couple of users. Well, there's a user that I have created called CS user, and I have a group called customer service users. So I'm going to take the group because that is how you would typically do this. And I'll click OK. And then OK once again. And then I'm going to take the authenticated users group and I'm going to remove it. Now you'll see here that it's going to give me warnings because it's basically saying, hey, this could potentially be problematic if you're going to go ahead and have it not being applied to your authenticated users. So I'll click OK. And there we go. So now with this level of security filtering, the settings in this particular GPO will only apply to anybody who is a member of the customer service users group. And that could be users and that could be computers as well. Okay, you can have users and computers that are in a group. Now, I do need to emphasize the starting point is where the GPO is linked, right? So demo GPO you'll see is linked to Chicago. In fact, if I click down below, you'll see it's also linked to New York. And you'll notice that regardless of whether I'm clicking on Chicago or whether I'm clicking on New York, the settings carried over. And that's why early on in the course, the very first time I clicked on a group policy object, it gave me that little dialogue that said, hey, any changes you make, they're going to be global. So the change is actually on the GPO itself, not one specific link. So what this is basically saying is this GPO will only affect users, we'll say, for the simplicity of just saying one object. It's going to affect users that are in the Chicago container and are in the New York container. But we're going to further filter it down now and say if they are a member of the customer service users group. Now, if somebody's a member of the customer service users group and they're in Los Angeles, they're still not going to have this GPO applied to them because the GPO is not linked to Los Angeles. All right, so you always got to start with first the container, and then security filtering is filtering it down further. All right, so that's how we can set it up so that we're only applying to a specific group. But I said there is another way, which is to do it the opposite, which is apply to everybody except for a certain group. So let's do that now. First of all, let me reverse this. Okay, so I'm going to put this back to authenticated users. And I'm actually going to remove customer service. Okay, there we go. So we're back where we were by default, where we're applying to everybody, all authenticated users. If I want to eliminate a group, what I have to do is go up to the delegation tab for the GPO. And you will see here that we have like an access control list, right, where we can see certain groups and what they can and can't do with this particular GPO. I'm going to click on Advanced. And when I do this, you'll see here I get a very familiar looking window if you've ever worked with the security tab of pretty much any other area of Windows. So let me click on authenticated users. And I want you to notice something. There are two permissions that authenticated users have been allowed here. Read, if I scroll down, apply group policy. Both of those are required in order to be able to have this group policy object apply to a member of that group. So what I need to do is if I want to say, for instance, we're going to apply this group policy object to all users except for a certain group, is I have to now add that group. So I'm going to put in customer service here. I'll do my customer service users group again. Click OK. And this time I'm going to deny the setting that says apply group policy. By denying that ability, that means that now the customer service users will not have this group policy applied to them. I'll click OK, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get a little warning message, and that's because I checked the deny box. If you've ever learned about security in Windows, you know that if you're a member of one group that's allowed and one group that's denied, deny wins. So deny can be very powerful. Therefore, you get a warning. It says, are you sure you want to do this? And I'm going to say, yes, I'm sure I want to do this. And now we have the customer service users, which are not going to have this particular group policy object settings applied to them, even if they reside in a container that the group policy object is linked to. And so this is how we can go ahead and use security filtering to help narrow down and get a little more precise on who and what exactly a group policy object will have an effect on. There is another type of filtering that you can see here that's also available when it comes to narrowing down who and what you're going to apply your group policy objects to. When you are on a group policy object, you will notice near the bottom here, there's a section for WMI filtering. Okay, it says this GPO is linked to the following WMI filter. And by the way, WMI stands for Windows Management Instrumentation. And the general idea is that this is a way to go ahead and create a filter that narrows down something about the computer usually that the user is on. All right, so the computer may have to have a certain amount of memory. I could think of an example if you were deploying software. Maybe you want to have enough hard drive space. Or maybe it needs to be running a certain operating system. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, to apply the WMI filter, it's simple. Right now it just says none. You click the drop down and you pick the filter you want. And you'll notice I don't have any options. The only option I have is none. Well, let's go ahead and fix that. Over on the left, you'll notice there's a container for WMI filters. If I click on it, you'll notice it's blank, right? I don't have any WMI filters. So you need to create one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say new, and we'll just call this demo WMI filter. Or in this case, you know what? Why don't we do this? Because I know what we're going to do with this filter. We're going to say Windows 10 WMI filter. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a filter that says only if it's a Windows 10 computer will the group policy object be applied. Okay, it won't apply if they're using a Windows 7, a Windows 8. It has to be a Windows 10 computer. So down here, where it talks about the queries, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on Add to add a query. I'm going to tell you point blank, I am not going to get into the query language and this and that. What I am going to do is I'm going to hit Paste. Okay, and this is basically a query that I already have saved on my machine here. And I will give you the basic gist of how this reads. It says select star, which represents select all. There's like a pool you're going to be pulling from Windows 32 operating systems where, okay, so now the pool is the operating systems, but we're going to have a condition here where the version is like 10 point little percentage symbol there, which basically says the version is like 10 point anything, and the product type equals 1, okay, which I believe, and I could be wrong on this, I think the 1 stands for retail. I'd have to look that up to tell you the truth. Okay, but this is the general idea that they're saying select pretty much all Windows 10 machines is what this query is saying. So I'm going to click OK. It saves it in here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on Save. And I now have a Windows 10 WMI filter. If I go back to one of my GPOs, so I'll go to another GPO, for instance, now I could select the Windows 10 WMI filter. It says, would you like to change this filter? Yes, I would. And now that filter has been applied. So that means computers that are running Windows 10 and users which are on computers which are running Windows 10. Outside of that, this GPO will not apply no matter where it is linked to. It does not matter where it's linked to. All right, so that's how you can use WMI filtering to help pinpoint some of the details of what group policy objects are going to affect what users and computers. Now, there are a couple of settings within group policy objects, and I know we haven't gotten to the group policy settings yet, so I am going to tell you that there's kind of a chicken and an egg situation here to where I really feel like I want to show you how settings work before I show you these settings, but these settings are related to group policy processing. So if you aren't that familiar with how settings work, just bear with me and watch what I'm doing, and then when you learn about settings, it'll make that all that much more sense. All right, so one of the two settings that we can do that will have an effect on group policy processing itself is something called loop back processing. Now, to show you this, I'm going to go into the settings of a GPO. All right, so I'm just going to take like my demo GPO, for instance. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to go to edit. All right, and that's how we get into the actual group policy management editor. In here, you will see that there are all sorts of settings. But first of all, they're divided into computer configuration and user configuration. If I expand the policies under either one, you can see, again, there's a hierarchy and there will be plenty of settings, but I'm not going to go into those settings yet. We're going to learn that in other videos. What I want to show you is we're going to go to a specific setting. All right. And that is under computer configuration, policies, administrative templates. I'm going to expand that And then you'll see here that we have an option here for system. I will expand that. And then there's a folder here for group policy. So I'm going to click on that folder. And over on the right, I can see all the various settings for group policy. And there's one in particular that I'm looking for, and that is one that's right here that I'm going to highlight. Configure user group policy loopback processing mode. Now I want you to notice that when I click on that, or pretty much any setting for that matter, there will be a description over on the left, okay, that'll give you a detailed description of what exactly this setting is doing. All right, now this is one of the most confusing things I have found over the last 20 plus years. People have been more confused about loopback processing than anything else. So let me explain to you what happens here. Okay, before we even do anything with this setting, I'm going to actually contract this back down. Understanding that there are computer and user configuration settings in a group policy object. Here's how it works. When a computer first turns on, that's when the computer settings will apply. In other words, that's when these computer configuration settings will apply. All right, so what happens is the computer turns on, and the computer itself will apply local settings. It'll look to see if it resides in a certain site, and any GPOs linked to that site, it'll apply those settings. Then it'll see what domain that computer's in, and it'll apply those settings. And then it looks to see what organizational unit or units that computer resides in. And I say units plural if it's a hierarchy of organizational units. And whatever GPOs are linked there, it applies those settings. But as it's doing that, only the computer configuration settings are applying. Then, once the computer has finished booting up, the user would log in. And when the user logs in, that's when the user settings kick in. Okay, the user configuration settings. But here's the thing you need to know. It doesn't matter what containers the computer is in. The user account will reside in whatever location that user resides in, as far as what site, domain, and organizational units it might be in. So the user settings will not come from the GPOs that are linked to the containers where the computer was. It'll come from the container where the user is. So where does loopback processing come into play? Loopback processing comes into play if you enable that setting. What you are telling the computer is when you boot up and you go through the group policy objects that are linked to the containers you are in, one of them you may come across is a GPO that will have, and I'm just going to expand this back down to where we were, it will have this user group policy loopback processing mode enabled. Now to enable it, I'm just going to double click to go into it, and then I would enable the setting. Okay, that's all I would have to do to set it, is I would just click enable. If that is the case, and I'm going to hold off on that for just a moment, what you are saying is, if that setting is enabled, when a user logs in, ignore the GPOs that the user may be linked to based upon its location, and come back to this GPO and use the user configuration settings here, so that all users on that computer, no matter who they are or where they exist, they will all have the same consistent settings. Now, one of the most typical places where you would want this to be in effect would be like a kiosk computer. Doesn't matter who's logging in, where they might be from, I want the same settings applied. Now, let me quickly jump back into the actual setting itself, because I want to show you something. I want to show you that when you enable it, you have an option here of replace mode or merge mode. Okay, it defaults to replace, but you could select merge. Over on the right, here is that description again of everything that it's doing, and it explains what replace versus merge does. Replace basically says use these settings, period. Don't just completely ignore the user and what group policies are linked to containers the user is in. Merge means you're going to go ahead and allow the user to have its own group policy settings applied, but you're going to also have the group policy settings that are on this group policy that are also going to be applied. And if there is a conflict, this policy wins. All right, so that is what loopback processing does, is it makes it that the user settings will be consistent on a computer regardless of what user is logging in. Another setting that we will find actually within a group policy object itself that actually can have an effect on the application of that group policy is something called slow link processing. All right, so here I'm still in the group policy management editor. So we're still looking at the actual settings of a group policy object. I will tell you that this particular setting can be found under both the computer configuration and the user configuration. So looking under the computer configuration first, let me go ahead and expand administrative templates, expand system, and then click on group policy. And then in this list, you will notice that there is an option here for configure group policy slow link detection. So I'm going to go ahead and double click to go into that actual setting. And what you'll see here is when I enable it, it then asks for an actual connection speed. It defaults to 500 kilobits, or what is about half a megabit. And what that is that is where you are configuring what is considered a slow connection in your environment. So that amount is completely changeable, right? I could go ahead and I could make it 1,000 if I want to say a megabit, or maybe 2 megabits, or whatever it may be. I can set this to whatever I want, and then that is what this system will consider to be a slow connection or a slow link. Now, why would you want to use this? Well, you may want to use this because there may be certain things you're doing. I had mentioned this before. I can mention this again. Like maybe you are deploying a software package, and doing that would be just unbearable over a link if it was too slow. So if you enable this particular option and your connection is slower than whatever you put for the connection speed, the GPO will determine it to be a slow link, and it will not apply the settings within that GPO. So that is where we can go ahead and configure it for computers. On the user side, we're going to go to basically the same place. User configuration, administrative templates, system, group policy. Now you'll notice that we don't have nearly as many options here when it comes to the user side of things. But one thing that we do have is configure group policy slow link detection. And it's going to be exactly the same setting. It's just a matter of applying based upon a user logging in as opposed to a computer turning on. If I enable it, I have to select the connection speed, and doing so will go ahead and determine that we have a slow link, and therefore we're not going to apply this group policy. All right, so that's how we can use slow link detection to affect the processing of a group policy object. So now has finally come the time where I get to show you how to configure the actual settings within a group policy object. Because up to this point in the course, I showed you how to create them, I showed you how to link them, I even saw how they process, but none of this makes any difference without actually configuring some settings. It's one of the last steps to actually deploying group policy. All right, so I want to show you that there's a number of different settings that we will find in our group policy objects. So for instance, here we are looking at the group policy management editor. So I'm looking at in the actual settings of one of our group policy objects. We see that it's broken down into computer configuration and user configuration. Under the policies, you'll see that we have some software settings, some Windows settings, and some administrative templates. Same thing under the user side. And when we expand these, well, you'll see that software doesn't do a whole lot. It has a lot to do with software installation. Windows settings, there's a number of different things we'll find there. But I'm going to actually go ahead and minimize those because what I want to talk to you about in this video is specifically the administrative template settings. Because this is the one we'll be working with the most often. And when I expand administrative templates, you'll see that there are a number of subfolders there. And on each of these folders, you can click and you'll find settings. But you might also find additional subfolders and then click on those folders and you'll find more settings. All right, so there are quite a few settings that we may have to deal with when it comes to administrative templates. And that's on the computer side. User side looks pretty much kind of like the same thing. What I want to show you here is how to configure a typical administrative template setting. All right, so I'm just going to pick one just for the sake of picking a setting. So here we're looking on the user side and we're looking at control panel. Let's take this one right here that says prohibit access to control panel and PC settings. When you highlight it, you'll see all of the details over to the left. Or if you double click on it, in the window under help, you'll see here that again, we have a full description of what this does. It basically says that this setting disables all control panel programs and the PC settings app. Now, I picked on this particular setting intentionally. And the reason I picked this setting intentionally is because you want to be careful. There are a lot of administrative templates that disable things. And so what that means is if I were to click to disable this particular setting, it's like a double negative. I am disabling the disabling of control panel, which means I'm actually explicitly enabling the control panel. Okay, so that's what I want you to be careful of. But let me go back here to where I clicked up top here. I want you to see the three settings. You got not configured, which basically just means this setting's not configured. This setting will be applied based upon some default setting either at the local policy level or through some other group policy object. Just not configured at all. Or we can enable the setting, which means we are going to apply whatever it says this setting does. Or we can disable, which means we are going to not apply, or we're going to do the opposite of whatever this setting does. Now, you may remember when I went through the order of application and inheritance, we talked about how a lot of these settings are like turning something on or off, right? I said it's like a light switch, turn them on or turn them off. That's what the enabled and disabled is. Turn it on, turn it off. And that's why it's important to know that you can have the same setting in multiple group policy objects. One might be set to enabled and another might be set to disabled. And therefore, that means that we have to know which one is going to be the winning GPO in order to know what setting is going to actually take effect. That setting, even if I enable it, under options, there are no options. It's just simple. Disable the control panel or don't disable the control panel. But what if I went to the one right below it here? It says show only specified control panel items. Or you'll notice there's also one that's very similar, but the opposite. Hide specified control panel items. In either case, if I were to go in there and then enable that particular setting, well, now it's asking us for a list of the disallowed control panel items. Okay, so sometimes you'll have an option where you have to actually specify details other than just enabling it. See, if I say show only, guess what? This one now says list of allowed control panel items. Okay, so the option will always be specific to whatever the setting in particular is. And that, I will tell you, for the most part, is how you configure administrative template settings throughout. It doesn't matter how many there are or where they are. It's almost always going to be enabled, disabled, or not configured. And then there may be some options based upon what the setting actually is. When it comes to configuring your administrative template settings, not only do you have to know how to do it, but the other problem is many administrators struggle with where to find the setting that they're looking for. Because there's a lot of settings. I mean, there are thousands of administrative template settings. I mean, here, if I look under the computer configuration, for instance, if I expand administrative templates, I can click on control panel, and there's two settings right there. But there's also more folders underneath. If I click on personalization, there's 7 or 8 more settings there. Regional language options, there's another 5 settings plus another folder. Inside that folder is one more setting. User accounts, one setting. Now, that might not look too bad, right? Well, what about network? If I click on network, I only got one setting there and a lot of subfolders. And guess what? Inside those subfolders are more subfolders and more subfolders. I see how many folders are going on here. This thing can get quite complicated. Now, you could look at all the settings by just clicking on all settings down here at the bottom of the administrative templates. But now nothing is organized at all. We just have this big, huge list of thousands of settings. And by the way, the same thing holds true on the user side. User, administrative templates, all settings. Another huge list. So, how do we solve this? How do we locate a setting that maybe we're already familiar with, or find out if there's a setting in the area of what it is we're trying to do? Now, you may recall from another video, for instance, a video on loopback processing. You watched me go to the computer configuration, administrative templates, and then I expanded system, and then I clicked on group policy. And then I had to go scrolling through here. And by the way, look, there were an awful lot of them to scroll through, right? And I had to find configure user group policy loopback processing mode. Now, that wasn't too difficult for me because I've actually done this many times in my career. So I kind of know where this setting is. But what if it was a setting that I don't use very often? Well, guess what we can do? If you come up here to the actual administrative templates container, if you right click, you go to filter options. And then here what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and check a box that says enable keyword filters. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put loopback as my filter. And you'll notice it says, where do I want to see this word? in the title of the actual policy, in the help text for that policy, or maybe even in the comments. I want to see if it's actually in the title itself, and click OK. And I want you to watch what happens when I do. Now what it did, first of all, because I set the filter is on. It turns on automatically when you set the filter options. But when I did that, notice my administrative template suddenly got very narrow here. It's only showing me the system container. And if I expand that, all it's showing me is the group policy container. And if I click on that, it's only showing me one setting. Configure user group policy loopback processing mode. It found the one setting that I was looking for. In fact, even if I click on all settings, I'm only going to get the one setting because I have filtered it down to only showing me things that have to do with loopback. And I knew that was because loopback processing would be what I was looking for. All right, so that's how you can go ahead and use the filter. You may be just wondering like, oh, is there a setting for this? Some technology or some concept that you're trying to do. Or you may know that there's a setting and you just want to find it quickly and easily. Now, real quick before I wrap things up, I do want to show you that if I want to get all my other group policy settings back, all I have to do is right-click on Administrative Templates and clear the checkbox on Filter On, and the filter now turns off, and everything goes back to normal, and we have all of our settings back in place once again. Besides our administrative templates, there are some other types of settings, and I want to look at a couple of them with you here. One of them is called folder redirection. Now, the idea behind folder redirection is that you can have users who will log on to different computers throughout your network, but have files that they use that are contained in certain folders, follow them around no matter what computer they are logged into. Now, if you happen to be a very old school administrator, you might recall something called roaming user profiles. And roaming user profiles was another way of having this happen, but there were a lot of pitfalls that went along with roaming user profiles, and folder redirection took its place, and it's much better. So, where do we find this? Well, we will find this under our user configuration and inside of our Windows settings, right? So if I expand Windows settings, you'll see we have folder redirection. Now, when I click on folder redirection, you'll see here that there are a bunch of folders. So I'm going to go ahead and expand that. And these are the folders that can be redirected. For instance, if you want a very specific desktop, you would configure that. Maybe the start menu. You want the user to see a specific start menu. You configure that. The one I'm going to show you, because I think it's probably the most common folder redirection there is the Documents folder, or what was previously known as the My Documents folder. This is a very common folder where users will actually save their files by default. You want the user's Documents folder to follow them no matter what computer they happen to be logged into. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to click on Documents here, and you'll see when I do, it's just blank, right? So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go to its Properties. You'll notice this is just a little bit different than how we configured our administrative template settings. So here, we have a setting, and it says Not Configured. There's a drop-down. Now, you might be thinking Enabled or Disabled, but guess what? That's not what it's going to say. Basically, there are two ways of enabling this. You could do what's called Basic, which is redirect everyone's folder to the same location. Okay, so you're redirecting it out to some share out on your network, and you want everyone's folders to all be stored in this one same location. Or you could go Advanced, which is where you specify individual locations based upon different groups. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and keep it simple. I'm going to do Basic. All right, now we're going to go ahead and give it a root path. So we're going to put in / and then the name of a server. I'm just going to put the word server. Okay, I don't actually have a share out there, but we're just going to pretend that this is a server that we have a share out on. And then I'm going to do / and I'm going to put share, which represents the name of the shared folder. Or I'll tell you what, I'll even put share folder, just because it represents a shared folder that's out on this server. I want you to notice that when I do that, here is what happens. See, it says create a folder under each user under the root path. So if you had a user named Claire, then Claire's Documents folder will be redirected to a server that we have out there with a share on it called shared folder. And in that shared folder share, it will create another subfolder named for the user. And then in that subfolder, it will put the Documents folder. Okay, so that is where Claire's Documents folder will actually be stored Even though to Claire, it'll look like she's just logged onto a machine, she saves to her documents folder. It looks like it's local on the machine, but it's actually being saved out to the network. Now let me jump up to the settings tab because there are some settings that we should be familiar with. First setting here is a checkbox that says grant the user exclusive rights to documents, to their own documents folder. That's usually a good idea, okay, because you don't want other users getting into different users' documents folders. There's a checkbox for move the contents of documents to the new location. That means when this group policy object is applied, let's just take user Claire, that was the example it had there. If user Claire already had some stuff in her own documents folder on an individual machine, go ahead and move that stuff out to the new shared location. It says also apply redirection policy to Windows 2000, Windows 2000 Server, XP. This is just for older operating systems if you have a need for it. And then at the bottom here, we have policy removal. Do we want to leave the folder in the new location when the policy is removed? Or do we want to redirect it back to a local user profile if this policy was to be removed? Okay, so it decides what happens when this policy goes away. So this is how you can take all of the various folders that you can see here that are part of a user's profile and store them out on a shared server rather than storing them on individual client computers if you would like to do so, using the folder redirection settings in group policy. Another type of setting that we have in group policy objects has to do with running scripts. Now here's what I think is super cool about having these scripting options available to be applied via group policy object. Especially back in the early days when group policy was first rolled out. People would ask me, they'd say, hey, I wanted to apply a certain something. Can it be done through group policy? And my answer was always and confidently yes. And the reason the answer is yes is that if there is not an actual group policy object setting that you can literally do to perform the function that you're looking to do, well, then you can write a script to do it and then have the script applied through group policy. So let's take a look here. We will find script settings under both the computer and the user configuration. Under the computer configuration, if I expand my Windows settings, you will see here that there is an option here for scripts. If I expand my Windows settings under the user configuration, you again see scripts. But you'll notice there is one slight difference. Under the computer configuration, it says scripts, startup, shutdown. Under the user side, it says scripts, log on, log off. Here's why. A computer will have its group policy object settings applied when the machine boots up, right? So when a computer boots up and it's going through the computer configuration side of things, that's where a startup script would run. When the user goes to log in, it goes under the user configuration, so that's where a logon script would come into play. Now, if this group policy object has been implemented, when the user logs off, that's when a log off script would go into effect. And if this group policy object was already in effect and the computer goes to shut down, that's where a shutdown script would kick in. All right, so that's where we can do, these are the 4 types of scripts that we can apply. Let me demonstrate how we would actually implement a script. I'm going to use the user side and we're going to deal with the logon script, okay? So here we have our scripts, and when I click on it, you'll notice that we have log on and log off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to double click on logon, and that takes me into the logon properties. So what I need to do is basically add a script that I want to have applied in this group policy object. Now on my computer, I will tell you that I've already created a script, and so I'm going to click on add, and I'm going to browse. And when I browse, I'm just going to go to, on this computer, I'm going to go to the C drive, and here is a file called logon.bat. It's a good old-fashioned DOS batch file, which is the most basic of basic scripts you will ever find. But for the sake of just showing you that this could be implemented, this is how we could go ahead and implement a batch file script. Now, here's the problem with doing it this way. If I do it this way, what ends up happening is when some user out there has this particular group policy object applied to them, if this logon.bat file doesn't exist on their local individual C drive, then it's not going to be found, and therefore it won't be run. So you don't ever want to do it from a local location. What I will tell you is that if I browse again, I can tell you that I do have a shared location. So out on DC1, I have a shared folder called scripts. And there I have a logon.bat file. Okay, so now I have a shared location. Now this is much better than what I had previously with the local location, but this still has one potential problem. And that is if that share exists in a location where a particular user who does have access to this group policy object but does not have access to that shared folder, well then this script can't possibly run because it won't be accessed. So I'm going to show you that that is actually not how we should do this at all. What I am going to show you is that rather than clicking on add here, I'm going to show you there's a button down here that says show files. When I click on show files, what it does is it actually takes me into a shared location that is specific to this group policy object. The group policy objects are all out in a shared location. If the user is able to access the group policy object, well then the user is able to access this location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to my C drive and I'm going to take that batch file and I'm going to hit copy. And I'm going to go back to this shared location and I'm going to paste it in there. Now, if I were to add and just simply say logon.bat, automatically where it's going to be looking for this is in this shared location that we found under show files. Okay, and as long as it exists there, which it does, the user will be able to access it and this script will run. Just simply click OK and we now have assigned a logon script to all the users who has this GPO actually applying to them when they log on. And that's how you can use scripts to pretty much perform any function via group policy object. Now, one other area of settings that I want to talk to you about is something called group policy preferences. Now, the group policy preferences includes more than 20 group policy extensions that now expand the range of configurable settings within the GPO. And what this really does is I will tell you, maybe if you've ever used group policy, but it hasn't been for a long time, maybe back in Windows 2000 or something like that, there now are options with settings and things you can configure using a group policy object that you previously could only do through a script. Okay, so these are additional extensions they've added on. So let's take a look. First of all, you'll notice that under both computer configuration and user configuration, we have preferences. And in both cases, when you expand it, you get Windows settings or control panel settings. And if you expand each of those, you'll see what the different Windows settings, control panel settings are that you can manage. That was on the computer side and then here on the user side. Now you'd have to click through some of these and each one is going to be just a little bit different. So I'm going to demonstrate one of these preference extensions for you. And that's this one under user configuration preferences that says drive maps. Okay, so I'm going to click on it and it brings over to the right where it says, there are no items to show because we haven't actually done anything yet. But this would be for the automatic mapping of a drive for a user when they log in and this group policy object applies to them. To make this happen, I need to right click on drive maps and select new mapped drive. And here I get the property windows. So right up at the top, the action, what are we going to do? Well, let's say we want to create a mapped drive for the user. Then we have to give a location. In other words, what is the actual share out on a server somewhere that we want to map the drive to? So if I said /DC1 /scripts, which happens to be a shared folder that I shared for the purposes of the demonstration of a previous video where I talked about using scripts, but that's a share I know I have. That is the location of that share. I can choose whether I want this to automatically reconnect all the time, which means it's persistent, or not. As far as a drive letter, I could use the first available drive letter for that individual user, or I can tell it to use a specific letter. So let's say for the sake of argument, since it's the scripts folder, let's use the S drive. That means to a user on their machine, they will just see an S drive, and that actually points out to this share. Now, we could connect as a specific user. In other words, if we needed specific credentials, we could put it in here and connect using those credentials. There are also some additional settings down here at the bottom as far as hide or showing this drive. Okay, and we're not going to really worry about that. That's more like if you wanted to connect to the drive and actually map the drive, but not show it to the user, maybe for other scripts that might access that drive. That's what those settings would be for. But up at the top, you'll notice there is another tab, and it's the Common tab. And let's take a look at some of these checkboxes. The first one says stop processing items in this extension if an error occurs. It means just that. If it runs into an error, just stop processing the items in this extension rather than have a user waiting to log in because it's being held up by an error. Do I want to run in the logged in user security context? Okay, do we want to actually be logged in as that user? Remove this item when it's no longer applied. This is an interesting one because this is something that's a little bit different than the policy settings. With a policy setting, the setting will automatically revert back to its default setting or however some other group policy is applying it if we remove that particular group policy object or that particular setting. With a preference, the setting will, whatever it does, and then you have to actually tell it, hey, if we get rid of this group policy object or if the user falls outside the realm of this group policy object, now go ahead and remove the map drive. You could do the other direction, which is apply once and do not reapply. So just do it one time, and then that's it. And then we have this thing called item level targeting. And this is one of the exciting things about preferences and what makes them a little bit more magical than just a regular policy setting. If I do item level targeting and then I click on targeting, this is where we can get very, very specific. So if I click new item, look at all the options I have here. Okay? So I can say that some specific setting needs to be a certain way in order for this particular setting to actually kick in. So for instance, if I just pick security group, just because it's a simple one to demonstrate. Now it says the user must be a member of, the security group. And then over here, you have to actually put in the security group that you want them to be a part of. So I know I have these customer service users, so I'm going to say customer service users, for instance. Okay, the user must be in that group. Or it could be that the computer must be in that group. Okay? That's how we can add specific targeting to narrow down who exactly this is going to apply it to. Right? Maybe only the customer service users need to have this S drive. So we can put that in place. And if we do that, you'll now see that we now have the creation of an S drive for any user that this group policy object applies to, and if they are a member of the customer service users group, to go ahead and map the S drive to the scripts folder out on DC1. And that is how we can use group policy preferences. When it comes to troubleshooting group policy, one of the things to take into consideration may be knowing whether a group policy object has actually applied to a user or computer, or whether changes you have made have taken effect yet for that user or computer. And the way we would know this has to do with having a good understanding of the group policy refresh cycle. So I want to show you here how we can both see and even set what our group policy refresh cycle is going to be. So here we're still looking at the group policy management editor. It really doesn't matter. I'm just still on my demo GPO, but this is on any group policy object. What we can do is under both computer and user configuration, we will find a refresh cycle setting. So I'm going to first show you the user side. Under user configuration, if I expand policies, expand administrative templates, expand system, and then click on group policy, you will see here that there is a policy for set group policy refresh interval for users. And on the left in the description, it says by default, user group policy is updated in the background every 90 minutes with a random offset anywhere from 0 to 30 minutes. And that just makes it so that we don't push the refresh out to everybody at the exact same moment. Okay, that's why we have that up to 30-minute random offset. Okay, so keep in mind that by default, the user settings will refresh in the background every 90 minutes. If we want to change that, let's just go into the actual setting itself. If we enable this setting, you'll see here that I can modify this so that it refreshes. I could make it refresh sooner. I could go ahead and say refresh every 30 minutes. Or maybe I don't need it refreshing that often. Right? You'll see here the maximum would be 44,640 minutes, or what is 31 days. So I can put in whatever I want. If I put in 1440, that would actually represent once a day it's going to refresh. And by the way, not only are we going to do that, but I can also choose what my random offset is so that they don't all hit the users at the same time. So maybe if we're going to do it once a day, we're going to refresh. Well, maybe we say something like a random offset of 120 minutes, which would be like anywhere from 0 to 2 hours that it'll differentiate between the different users. Okay, so that's just an example of how we could set the group policy refresh interval for users. Now I'm going to actually hit cancel. I'm not looking to configure that. I just wanted to show you. Let's jump over to the computer side, computer policies, administrative templates, system, group policy, right? We're actually navigating to the exact same place. Here, there's a lot more settings to be digging through, but if you look near the bottom here, you'll see here there's 2 settings that we actually care about. The group policy refresh interval for computers, okay, this is for just regular computers, versus right below it is set group policy refresh interval for domain controllers. Okay, so first let's look at all regular non-domain controller computers. You will see here that again, the default is every 90 minutes with an offset of 0 to 30 minutes. Same as the users. And if I want to alter that, guess what? Exactly the same way. Enable it, and then I can configure the actual settings. The group policy refresh interval for domain controllers, however, one very specific thing that I want you to notice is that there is a paragraph here that says, by default, group policy on the domain controllers is updated every 5 minutes. So domain controllers, because they play such an important role, if you do make a change to a group policy object that is affecting the domain controllers, that is going to happen pretty much almost right away, within 5 minutes. And if I go in here, you will see here that if I enable this one, I don't have to have it in 5 minutes. I could still make it all the way up to 44,640 minutes or 31 days. But the reality is that there's a reason that they set it for 5 minutes, and you should probably leave it alone. Now, speaking of leave it alone, I will tell you that for the most part, you should never adjust these particular settings. You got to have an actual reason. Don't just do it because, oh, I learned I could adjust this setting. No, you got to have a reason for it. Microsoft does a pretty good job of setting the defaults up to what most organizations are going to need. You just need to take a look if you're having an issue with either group policy not refreshing fast enough or if it's refreshing too often and causing too much network traffic. That would be a reason that you might come in here and actually change the refresh interval for your users, computers, or domain controllers. When helping a user to troubleshoot a situation they may be having, if that is related to a group policy object, let's say change that you've made, you may need to get that change or that update to be pushed out to that user or that computer. Now, there are a few different ways that we can make this happen. One way we can do it is by literally telling the user to log off and log back in or to reboot their computer. Okay, because by default, that's when group policy objects are applied. The computer settings are applied when a computer is rebooted. Well, those settings are being applied when the user logs in. All right, so that's one way, right? One way is just tell the user, log off, log back in, or reboot their machine, or both. But that might be a little bit too intrusive to what the user's trying to do, right? They might have things going on in their machine. Depending on how much configuration you have, it might take a while for that machine to reboot or to log back in. So let me show you another way we can do it. And this is through a command line tool called GP Update. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to click on Start, and I'm going to type in CMD, which just takes me to a regular old command prompt. And then here in this command prompt, I'm going to literally just type in GP Update. Now, before I hit Enter, I do want to kind of point something out to you. And that is, right now, I'm logged in to the domain controller itself. And that means I'm actually applying the update to this domain controller itself. This is not a tool that can be used to push an update down to a user. So what I'm showing you here is something you would have the user do themselves on their machine. If you had a user and you made some changes to a group policy object and you needed those changes to kick in, you need to tell the user to open up command prompt and type GP Update. And when I hit Enter, what you'll see here is you'll see that it's going to update the policy. And in just a moment, you'll see that it has updated the computer policy settings. And then it's going to say that the user settings have been updated. All right, so I just forced the update down to this machine, this computer, and this user that I'm logged in as. Now, there are some other settings that go with GP update, so I'm going to do a /? So that you can see some of these options. And the main options I want to point out are actually the first two. Now, you'll see that there are some other options down near the bottom, like log off or boot, which would literally force a log off or a reboot. But at that point, in my opinion, other than if you're doing this via scripting, if you're literally manually telling a user to do this, well, that just means that you might as well just told the user just to reboot or log off and log back on. So let's look at these top two settings. The first one is target, /target, and then you put target computer or target user. Now, I want to emphasize again, this is not done to push an update out to a computer or out to a user. When I hit GP update, you saw that it said updated the computer policy, and then it said it updated the user policy. /target and you put computer or user means if we only want to update the computer or the user settings. That's all that means. Okay? And the other setting here is /force. When you do an update, what it typically does is it will only update any group policy object settings that have changed. Whereas if you know that you want all group policy object settings to be re-implemented all over again, then you put a /force. Okay, so that's what those settings are for. All right, so that was the second way, right? First way is you have the user log off, log on, or reboot the machine. Second way is to use GP update. The third way is a way that you actually can basically kind of force or push down the updates. And that is here in group policy management. If you click on a container, okay, so this wouldn't be for just one individual user or computer, but a whole container. I'm going to take the Chicago container, and I'm going to right-click, and you'll see there is an option here for group policy update. Now, I picked this one intentionally because I want you to see the error that you're going to get. Okay, I'm going to get a little error, really a warning. It says, you've chosen to force a group policy update on computers within the Chicago and all subcontainers, but there aren't any. Okay, so it's just saying, great, you just forced an update down to a bunch of machines that, well, there aren't any, so there's no point. Now, the only machines I actually have on my network are domain controllers, and they're all in the domain controllers container. So I'm going to use this container to actually show you. If I right-click and select Group Policy Update, this time it's going to look a little bit different. This time it's going to tell me you have chosen to force a Group Policy Update on all computers within this container and subcontainers. All right, so it says there are 3 computers in there because I happen to have 3 of them. It says, are you sure? And I'm going to click on yes. And when I do, you'll see it's going to go through. Now, I want to show you that one thing is going to happen here that I don't really want you to worry about. It has to do with my specific configuration that I have here. And that is, you'll see here that 2 of them failed and 1 of them succeeded. That is nothing more than I have a fake demo environment here. These machines are not communicating effectively with one another. And so it's nothing to worry about. In fact, I considered deleting these just so you wouldn't even see the failure. But just take my word for it. This is just going through and showing you that it succeeded on this machine and it failed on the others. But in a production environment, you should be able to get it to succeed on all of the machines in that container. All right, so that is the third way that you can push a group policy update out in the event that you've made changes and you need those changes to take effect in the effort of helping you troubleshoot a user's problem. To help you with the process of troubleshooting group policy object application to your users and computers, there are a couple of tools that Microsoft has included here in the group policy management tool. You may remember from one of the very first videos in this course, I had mentioned when we were looking at everything we would find here, down at the bottom, group policy modeling and group policy results. And I said we would eventually get there. Well, these are the 2 tools that they have given you to help with troubleshooting. For this video, let's talk about group policy results to be specific. This is a tool that can help you to tell you the result of exactly what happened when a certain user logs into a certain computer, right? So if a user has logged into a machine and they're calling, I don't see such and such, and maybe a group policy was supposed to give it to them, something like that. What you can do is this tool, you can actually give it the scenario of the user who you're trying to help troubleshoot and what computer they're logging onto. So let's see how this looks. If I right-click on Group Policy Results, I get the Group Policy Results wizard. Here in this wizard, I get a welcome screen. I'll click on Next. Now you need to pick what computer the user logged onto. Now in my demo environment, I only have one computer that any user has ever logged onto, and that's the one I'm on right now, DC1. So I'm just going to leave it at this computer, but in a production environment, I would actually probably click another computer, right? If I was helping somebody troubleshoot, and then I would pick the computer that they are logging into. Then I'm going to click next, and the same thing goes for what user you want to choose. Again, whether I do current user or a specific user, it doesn't matter because the only user I can select is the land and hotel administrator. Why? Because that's the only user who has ever logged into this machine because this is just my demo environment. I've never logged in as another user. If I did, I would see a list of users. Right? And it says this list only shows users that have logged onto this computer. Okay, so it's not going to matter, but I'm going to go ahead and just pick the land and hotel administrator or the current user. And again, in a production environment, you would select the user who you're actually helping. I'm going to click next. Here's a summary of what we're going to do. Basically, we are looking at, do we want to see what happened when the land and hotel administrator logged on to DC1? Yes, that's what we want. Next. Now it's going to go through and it's going to gather the settings and finish. And when I do, it's going to generate a report for me of what happened. And it's a nice little HTML document here. I'm going to go up to the Details tab up top here. And to be able to see everything, over in the far right where it says Show All, I'm going to click Show All to show all settings because I want you to see as I scroll down, there is a whole lot of information about various settings that were applied on both the user and computer side and where that setting came from. Okay, so to be specific, let me scroll back up near the top here. Here, it is showing me, for instance, that there are some password policy settings that were put into effect for this particular user. It says that the enforcing password history, 24 password remembers. Okay, that was actually put into effect for this user when they logged on. And where did that setting come from? Over to the right here where it says winning GPO. It says it came from the default domain policy. And in fact, if I scroll down, you'll see that everything is from the default domain policy or from the default domain controller's policy. Why? Because those were the only two policies that were in effect when I logged on. Yes, as part of this course, I have been demonstrating the creation of some other demo GPOs and things like that, and I even set some settings, but for the most part, I really haven't set anything that would change. So everything I'm going to see here is going to, right now, be just from default domain policy or default domain controller policy. But overall, the point is that if a user has some setting and you're thinking, why do they have that setting? That's not right. It's supposed to be something else. You find the setting in this report and you see what GPO it's getting it from. And then from there, that can help you troubleshoot and make you say, now I have to go back and look at the order of application and inheritance and all that stuff to see why or what needs to change to get that setting to come from the correct GPO. Another troubleshooting tool that Microsoft has built right into the group policy management tool is group policy modeling, which we see right above group policy results. And by the way, it's very, very similar, but with one key difference. Group policy results is a tool that shows you what already happened when a user logged into a certain computer. Group policy modeling is more of a what-if scenario. It doesn't have to have happened yet. It could be a matter of you think you've configured everything properly. Now you want to maybe preemptively troubleshoot and say, well, what if certain user logs into a certain machine? Are they going to get the settings I thought they were going to get? Or let me give you another scenario. Let's say you are troubleshooting with a user. You go through group policy results. You see a problem. You think you have fixed the problem. Rather than forcing the user to have to go through a log off, log on, reboot, GP update, whatever, you could do a what if with this group policy modeling to see if that's actually going to fix the problem for the user before you make them have to get the refresh. So let's see how this works. If I right click on group policy modeling, I get the option of the group policy modeling wizard. And this is going to be similar, but keeping in mind that it's more of a what if. So I'm going to click on next. The first thing it's going to ask me here is, you want to process this simulation on what domain controller? Right? In other words, what domain controller is the user actually logging into? And that can be the problem. Maybe you don't have replication set up properly between your domain controllers. And so the result is when the user authenticates through, let's say, DC1, everything works fine. But if the user authenticates through DC2, maybe it doesn't work fine. Okay, or in this case, maybe DC3 because it's part of a different site. Maybe you just don't have good replication, good communication. All right, so you can bring it right down to that level of troubleshooting and figuring this out. So I'll just say any domain controller is fine. I'll click next. Now is where we do the user and computer selection. So we say, what if certain user logs into a certain computer? And now it can be any user on any computer. So for instance, for the user, I could actually put in the customer service user, right? What if the customer service user was to log in to, we'll say DC1, okay? Not that that would be very practical because you don't have users logging into domain controllers, but you could do that. Now, you also don't have to pick a specific user in a specific computer. You could do it based upon the individual container. So you could just say a user who's in the Chicago users container is logging into a computer that's in the Chicago computers container, okay, just to give an example there. Now, at this point, I could check this box near the bottom that says skip to the final page of this wizard without any additional data, because that's all the hypothetical I need. I just want to hypothetically know what will happen if customer service user logs into DC1. But I'm not going to check that box because I want to show you the other settings options. We're not going to set any of them. I just want to show you that they exist. So I'll click on next. We have advanced simulation options where we can say, what if it was a slow network connection? Maybe that's the problem. What if loopback processing was put into place? Okay, so those are some options. What other options do we have? We could put a new location for this particular user or computer. In other words, we said this specific user and computer, what if they were in a different container, so to speak? I could change them here. These are the groups that this user happens to be a member of. Well, what if I want to go ahead and add or remove any groups to say, okay, let's pretend like we actually added or removed this user from those groups. Then what would happen? Same thing with the computer groups. Same thing if we implemented a WMI filter for users or computers. And now we get to the end where we have a summary of everything we're doing. Again, notice almost everything is set to none or not specified because I just skipped all the potential options. Just wanted to show you they were there. The main thing is I'm saying, what if customer service user logs into DC1? So I'll click next. It's going to do the simulation and then finish. And once again, we are going to get a nice little HTML report. I'm going to click on the details tab, click on show all, just like I did before. And now here is a report that looks just like the other report that we saw. The only difference is that this was a what if scenario as opposed to what already happened scenario. And as we saw, there were also options that we could put in place to kind of tweak, like what if I make this change? Then what would happen? And maybe that's how we could find the change that we have to make to help troubleshoot a situation with group policy application. One of the ways that we can help keep our networks secure is through the use of password policies. So these are policies that we can configure to do things, like telling users that they have to change their password after a certain amount of time. Maybe it has to be a certain length or complexity. Well, these password policies can be pushed down through group policy objects. Now, to demonstrate this, I want to tell you, I could go in to edit any of our GPOs. But there is a point that needs to be made here, and that is, even though you will find the password policy settings in all group policy objects, they will only be in effect if that group policy object is linked to the domain. It must be applied at the domain level. You cannot apply a lower organizational unit level. So the only policy I have here that is linked to the domain is my default domain policy. So we're going to actually use that one for the sake of looking at these policy settings. So I'm going to right click and choose to edit the default domain policy. This takes me into my group policy management editor. Now where you will find the password policy settings, even though it seems like it should be under the user configuration, right? Because it has to do with users logging in. It actually is under the computer configuration, policies. Under policies, we're going to go to Windows settings. Inside Windows settings, we're going to go to security settings. I'm going to expand that. And let me make this so we can see a little bit more. Inside the security settings, here's account policies. I'm going to expand that. And that's where we'll find our password policy. If I click on it, you'll see that there are a number of different password policy settings. Now, some of these have been around for a very long time and may be very obvious. And there's actually a couple of brand new ones that have been recently added. So let's just kind of go through these quickly. First would be enforced password history. This is just a matter of when a user goes to change their password, they can't use the same password as they've used X number of times, right? In this case, 24 times. If I think 24 is too much or too little, I simply double click to go in. Here's the setting. So maybe I say, you know what? How about we say 12 passwords remembered? And I click OK. There we go. Maximum password age. How long may a user have their password before they are forced to change it? It defaults to 42 days, which is 6 weeks. Again, if I want to change that, just go in, make it 30 days. Again, I'm just making arbitrary changes here. Now, here's one that confuses people. Minimum password age. It is just what it sounds like. The minimum password age is set by default to 1 day. And that means when a user changes their password, they must keep that password for the whole day. And the reason for this setting is because there were some smart people out there who figured out when their companies told them that they had to get a new password, right? Let's say 30 days were up and they were told they have to get a new password and they know they couldn't use the same password that they used the last 12 times. What they would do is they would change their password and then they would immediately say, change it again, change it again, change it again, change it again. They would change it 12 or 13 times to where they've cycled through the whole 12 passwords remembered and go right back to the original password that they started with. That does not help create a secure environment. So that's why we put a minimum password age so that a user can't do that. Minimum password length. How long does the password have to be? It defaulted here to 7 characters. I could increase it or decrease it, right? We'll just say 8. That's a common number we see out there. I'll say, all right, it must be at least 80 characters. Now I'm going to skip this minimum password length audit for a moment because that's one of the 2 new ones that they've added. I'm going to go to password must meet complexity requirements. I'm going to actually go in here and I'm going to show you on each of these settings, there is an explain tab. And this is similar to what we saw in the administrative templates built right into the window. But here's where it'll tell you what this means. Basically what it means is there are 4 different types of categories of characters, right? It says contains characters from 3 of the following 4 categories. There's uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and then non-alphabetic characters, right? Like symbols. All right, so you need to know that that's part of the complexity, and I'll explain what it means. What does it say here? It says for complexity, it says it cannot contain the user's account name or part of the user's full name that exceeds 2 consecutive characters. It must be at least 6 characters in length. That's regardless of what the other policies said for a minimum. And it contains characters from 3 of the 4 categories. So of that uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and characters, it's got to have 3 of the 4. That is what it means if you enable password complexity. And one other one that we don't really talk about, you can go ahead and you can read the explanation here. This is store password using reversible encryption properties. The short version of this is there's a section down at the bottom here where it says this policy is required when using certain authentication protocols. Just going to keep it as simple as that. That's where you might implement that, but not a common thing that we deal with. All right, so now let's go into the 2 new ones. Here it says relax minimum password length limits. Interesting. Well, let me go ahead and let's go in here and let's go to explain. Well, what this is basically telling us is that the minimum password length used to be a maximum of 14, meaning 14 was the longest you could make the minimum length to be. Whereas now with this setting, if you enable it, you can go higher than 14. What does that mean? Right? That might have sounded confusing to you. Well, let me show you. If I jump over here to minimum password length, I want to show you that when I increase it, I'm just hitting the up arrow, 11, 12, 13, 14. And if I hit up arrow again, it goes down to 0. Okay, that's all I can do is I can only go to a maximum of 14. It's as far as I could go. Okay. If I enable this minimum password length limits, so I'm going to say define it and it's enabled and click apply. It gives you a little warning, and it might have an effect on compatibility with certain clients because this is only for newer operating systems. I'm going to say, yep, that's okay. And I'll click OK. Now when I go to minimum password length, 13, 14, hey, look, 15, 16, 17, 18. I can now go higher than 14. That's what that setting is for, is that the minimum password length can now be increased beyond 14. I really hope that's not being used very often because that just sounds crazy to me to force somebody to use a password longer than 14 characters. All right, one more setting here. Minimum password length audit. This is another kind of confusing one, so I will try to explain it to you beyond the Explain tab. This just talks about, it determines the minimum password length for which password length audit warning events are issued. All right, what does this mean? And it goes down here, it says if the setting is not defined, events will not be issued. If it's defined with less than or equal to minimum password length setting, audit events will not be issued. If it's set to greater than the minimum password length and the length of the new account password is less than the setting, then you'll get an audit event. Okay, what does this mean? All right, so right now, I have a minimum password length set of 8 characters. If I turn on this auditing, and let's say I made it 10 characters. Okay, here's what this means. It's a way of finding out when your users change their password, and it has to be at least 8 characters. If they're doing 8 characters or 9 characters, which is less than the 10, then it will go ahead and it will give you an audit notification to say that this has happened. The reason for this is because this might be a way to soft roll out to your users that you're going to ask them for longer passwords. In other words, you might say, look, the minimum is 8, but it's going to be 10, or maybe it's going to be 12, or whatever it may be. So please start doing that now. And then you can kind of audit to see when the users are actually all complying and or where there are users who are still not complying. And you know that those are the users you're going to have to forewarn, hey, now it's going to become an actual rule, so be ready for it because it's going to hit you harder than everyone else. Okay, so that's what that minimum password length audit setting is for. And this is how you configure an overall password policy to help keep your network more secure. Another type of policy that we can use to help keep our systems secure is the account lockout policy. Now, one thing I want to tell you is similar to the password policy, it needs to be applied at the domain level. Okay, so the account lockout policy, those settings only matter when you're looking at a GPO that is linked to a domain. So what we are looking at here is we're in the Group Policy Management Editor, and we're actually in the exact same location we were for the password policies, which is under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies, and then here we have Account Lockout Policy. I'm going to click on that, and you will see that there are 3 settings that go with the account lockout policy. Now, the main thing that this policy is there to help protect against, it's there to help protect against basically somebody trying to hack into the system by guessing at somebody's password. So, let's look at these 3 settings. I'm not going to look at them in order. I want to do it kind of in a way that's easier to explain. We're actually going to jump to the middle one first, which is account lockout threshold. This is the one where we say, after X number of wrong passwords, go ahead and lock out this account. All right, so let me go in here, and if we go ahead and define this setting, we can say the account will lock out after, and we'll just say, for instance, 5 invalid logon attempts. Okay, somebody is sitting at the machine, they're guessing at passwords. If they guess at them 5 times with the wrong password, now the account is locked out, and it doesn't even matter if they guess the right password because the account has been locked out. All right, now I'm going to click OK, and I want you to see what happens. It's actually going to make suggestions on what we should maybe change the other settings to, right? There were 3 settings in here, and it says if you set the 1, you should maybe set these others. Both of these are suggesting to set the 30 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and I will hit OK, and you'll see here that it now takes those suggestions for those others. But let's talk about those others. Let's talk about account lockout duration. What this one is this one says once the account has been locked out, right? Somebody has done the wrong password 5 times. The account has been locked out. How long does it stay locked out? Now, if I set this to 0, you'll see here that 0 minutes says account is locked out until the administrator unlocks it. So if you set it to 0, that means, hey, the account's locked out and it's going to stay that way until somebody calls into help desk and takes out a ticket for an administrator to release the account. But typically that's not necessary. Typically you can put a certain number of minutes. I like to use 15. I know it had recommended 30, but I'm going to do 15. And this basically says, if we think of this scenario, the scenario is somebody tried the wrong password 5 times. The account locks out. They now have to sit for 15 minutes before they can try again, right? Before the account is even released to try again. By doing that, it's enough of a deterrent. Someone's not going to sit there and it's going to take them forever to guess the right password. But what's cool about having it automatically release in 15 minutes is when you have a user who legitimately just, maybe came back from a long vacation or something and they forgot their password and they were trying some of the passwords that they thought it might have been and their account gets locked out. And then they remember, oh yeah, I remember what my password is. Rather than having to call in and ask for access to their account, they can wait 15 minutes and they can do it on their own. So that's what that setting is for. And you'll notice, by the way, when I change that one, it suggests, oh, well, then we should also change the other one as well. Sure, why not? Now they're both set to 15 minutes. So what is this last one? Reset account lockout counter. What this one has to do with is we said if there's 5 failed login attempts, lock the account out. Well, what this is saying is when it's counting, like 1 bad attempt, 2 bad attempts, 3 bad attempts, if 15 minutes pass without an attempt, we're back down to the first bad attempt, second bad attempt. And again, I'm fine with these 15 minutes because that's basically saying, all right, if the person who's trying to hack in knows they can only have 5 failed attempts, all right, whatever. Now they can only do 4 and then still have to wait 15 minutes before they can try any more attempts. All right. So again, account lockout policy, it's there to prevent users from trying to guess at passwords. The threshold is how many invalid attempts they can make before getting locked out. The lockout duration is how long it'll be locked out once it gets locked out. And then the reset account lockout counter is how long there's a reset in the event that there were some bad attempts made so that it doesn't just continue forever counting invalid attempts. And that is how you configure the account lockout policy.